The jaw-dropping mourning of the dead in the Victorian era is bizarre. Let's step back in time and prepare to have your jaw drop at the bizarre mourning rituals of the dead in the Victorian era. From death portraits to hair jewelry, the Victorians had a unique way of honoring their departed loved ones that will leave you both fascinated and disturbed. Whether it was the practice of preserving the deceased's hair or dressing them up in elaborate outfits, the mourning customs of the time were truly jaw-dropping. For the Victorians, death was a constant mourning reality, whether it occurred inside their own homes or on the streets. Long before Queen Victoria's reign, extravagant funerals had already come to be considered the norm. All social classes in Victorian society shared the desire to ensure a dignified burial for family members, even if it resulted in hardship for the family's surviving members. Being buried in a pauper's grave was regarded as the height of shame. After Prince Albert passed away in 1861, Queen Victoria entered a state of profound mourning, which increased public demand for formal mourning attire like black crepe clothing and jet jewelry. During this time, mourners were expected to follow strictly enforced mourning periods, regardless of their age or social standing. In contrast to Britain, where mourning customs were strictly adhered to, Australia took a more lax approach, especially in rural areas where funerals were less extravagant and customs less rigid. However, in the 1870s, both Australia and Britain underwent funeral reforms with the goal of encouraging more simple and affordable funerals. This was accomplished by encouraging people to reuse or modify old clothing for the period of mourning, rather than buying new clothes. Women's mourning clothing during the Victorian era included a variety of accessories, including purses, stationery, umbrellas, fans, and hair accessories. Men, on the other hand, typically complemented their everyday attire with a black hatband or gloves. Black silk crepe, which was almost solely produced by Courtauld, a single company, was the material most frequently associated with mourning. Crepe was regarded as suitable for mourning because it had a flat, lifeless quality as opposed to lustrous materials like furs, satin, and velvet. Additionally, it was considered immoral and callous to dress in bright or attractive clothing while in mourning. After the prescribed period of mourning had passed, it was also bad luck to have crepes in the house, so every subsequent bereavement was a lavish and expensive affair. Widows were only permitted to wear gray and lavender during the half-mourning period. Children in middle-class Victorian families were expected to wear full black mourning outfits for 1 year following the loss of a parent or sibling. Girls' dresses were frequently fashioned after their mother's mourning outfit. In addition, the Latin proverb memento mori, which means remember death, was taken to heart during the Victorian era. As physical remembrances of the deceased, mementos, such as lockets, brooches, and rings, contained a lock of hair and a photograph were used. These mementos were especially well liked in Australia, where cherished ones might have passed away and been interred far away. In addition to being sentimental gifts from the living, hairpieces served as powerful remembrances after the recipient passed away. Victorian mourning customs also included a significant amount of photography. Families without the funds to commission painted portraits could arrange for a quick and inexpensive photo to be taken after a death. When there was no existing photograph of the deceased, this was especially crucial. Images of the deceased could be sent off to far-off relatives thanks to the invention of the carte de vista, which allowed multiple prints to be made from a single negative. The deceased was frequently portrayed in postmodern photographs as if they were peacefully sleeping rather than being dead. However, at other times, the body was posed to look alive. Regardless of the pose, these pictures served as replacements and recollections of the loss, enabling families to cherish their loved ones' memories. Not just that, people in the Victorian era recorded their final wishes in great detail, occasionally even when they were in excellent health. For instance, Mary Drew left a 56-page last will and testament with specific instructions on what should be done after her passing. At the time, it was very important to receive mementos from the dead, so Mary gave books to the men and jewelry to her female friends. She even made certain that her friends, who didn't get anything valuable, received hair pieces from her as souvenirs. Hair jewelry also rose in popularity as a way of preserving a loved one's memory. Many women imitated Queen Victoria, who wore a locket containing her late husband's hair every day. Intricate patterns were woven into brooches, earrings, and necklaces as time went on, and people even made wreaths out of the hair they collected from numerous deceased loved ones. Hair jewelry was highly prized because it could be kept as a permanent memento and was resistant to decay. Today, a large number of these items are still on display in museums and are remarkably well preserved. There were also strict guidelines for the style and material of mourning clothing. For instance, the fabric had to be made of drab, lusterless materials like bombazine and crepe during the most intense stage of mourning. The fabric could have a slight sheen as the mourning period went on, and eventually black silk was permitted. Mourning gowns had to have a high neckline, and decorations were not permitted. To symbolize the widow's state of mourning, veils and widow's caps were also worn. Not only members of the immediate family wore mourning attire. Depending on their relationship to the deceased, other family members, close friends, and even domestic helpers were expected to do the same. This implied that purchasing a mourning attire could become an expensive proposition, particularly for people from the middle and lower classes. Some women resorted to buying used black clothing or renting mourning attire. In the early 20th century, the strict guidelines governing mourning attire gradually relaxed as mourning traditions and social mores changed. Today, mourners are free to express their grief and pay tribute to their loved ones in whatever way they choose. Mourners are no longer expected or required to wear mourning attire. Nonetheless, it is true that lingerie was required to be worn with mourning attire during the Victorian era. The obsession with death and mourning was reflected in fashion, and black clothing was seen as a symbol of respect for the deceased. But it's a myth that women were encouraged to take opium and arsenic to look pale and almost dead. Even though having pale skin was considered fashionable at the time, using toxic substances to achieve this would have been widely viewed with disapproval. It is also true that black is frequently viewed as a symbol of eroticism and sexual power. This association between black lingerie and sexuality is also true. This, however, is not exclusively a Victorian invention. Black has long been regarded as a provocative and alluring color. Black has long been considered a color that evokes sexuality. The link between death and sexuality is not unique to the Victorian era. There are numerous instances of societies that honor the dead and draw inspiration from them for their works of literature, art, and other forms of expression. Victorian times also saw a rise in the popularity of death masks, and many famous people had their faces cast in plaster after passing away. One of the most well-known is Beethoven's death mask, which was created just hours after his passing. It is said that to make the mold, his secretary dipped a lock of Beethoven's hair in plaster. Death masks were used as a scientific tool as well as a way to remember a loved one. Today, death masks are still made, but they are mostly used for art or historical purposes. Some museums have death masks of famous people on display, and some artists create sculptures using death masks as a reference. However, Christian mourning customs and elaborate Victorian funerals came to an end during the First World War in the British Commonwealth. Extensive funerals and personal displays of mourning at home seemed inappropriate and self-indulgent in light of the staggering number of soldiers who died and were buried abroad, as well as the ensuing collective grief. In a nutshell, the Victorians had a unique way of mourning their dead, and their customs are as bizarre as they are fascinating. From hair jewelry to death photography, their practices provide a window into a bygone era. If you're fascinated by history and want to learn more about the strange customs of the past, tune in and subscribe to our history channel. From the Victorian era to ancient civilizations, there's always something new to discover.